Many students who would like to get a 5 on AP CSA and who take time to prepare still bomb the exam. Often the reason for this comes down to a few simple mistakes. For example, many students confuse overloading and overriding. These two words sound the same, but they're not the same. Let's look at a simple example. So is this overloading or is it overriding? Take a second to look at that. Whenever I show code, you are welcome to pause and read the code if you'd like. I'll give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. So this is going to be overloading. What is overloading? How do I know that this is overloading? So we've got two method A's. We've got the same name of the method, but we have two different parameter lists. So when I make an object of type example, I can call method A in two different ways. I can call it with no arguments, or I can call it with a single string. So based on the type and the number of the parameters, the compiler can know which method I want, so this gets resolved at compile time. So overloading is the same name, but different parameters. Now how about this one? This is a bit trickier. Is this overloading, overriding, both, or neither? Again, you're welcome to pause and read it. If you'd like, I'll give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. And this may surprise some of you, but actually this is still just overloading. So what's going on here? You might have thought overriding is when you have a superclass and subclass, and it can be, but this is still overloading. And what happens here is that the subclass, subexample, it gets a free copy, okay? Gets free copy of method B via inheritance. And so then when I make an object of type subexample, the lower class, it has two method B's. It has a method B with no arguments, and it has a method B that takes a string. So with that object of type subexample, I can call method B in two different ways. So it's very much the same thing as the previous example, even though one of the method B's came from the superclass. This is still overloading. So you might be thinking, okay, I've got that. What does overriding look like? Here's overriding. So overriding, you'll notice, does have the superclass and the subclass. Here we've got superexample and subexample, and we've got method C here. And the key difference here is that method C and the superclass and subclass are the same, exactly the same method signature. So what do I mean by method signature? I mean that it's got the same parameters and the same name, exactly the same. And so basically what happens here is that subexample, it can't really directly use that method C in the superclass because the method C in the subclass sort of replaces the one in the superclass. It overrides the one in the superclass, the method C in the superclass. So that's what overriding is. It's going to be the same method signature in the superclass and the subclass, and actually the compiler cannot 100% figure out which exact version you want when it compiles. So this only gets resolved at runtime. So now you know the key differences between overloading and overriding. Overloading is same name but different parameter lists. Overriding is same name and same parameter lists, to where the subclass version overrides or replaces in objects of the subclass the method of the superclass. And just remember, overriding gets resolved at runtime, overloading gets resolved at compile time. The second simple mistake that ruins a high score on AP CSA is that many students skip the details when they're learning about inheritance. Now, a lot of people have a general idea about how inheritance works in Java, but a general idea is not enough if you want to get a 5. You have to know specific details. So here's a quick riddle for you about inheritance in Java. Why doesn't this compile? Have a close look at that code. I'll give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. So this does not compile because of right here, this.id. Now, you might think that, okay, an employee is a type of person. A person has an ID. Therefore, an employee also has an ID, which is true. And therefore, inside employee class, I get to use the ID, which is false. You don't get to directly look at or use private information from the superclass. This does not get to look at this directly, and it will not compile. And like I said, I can see how it makes sense. You would think the employee is a type of person, so it can access all of the private data that it inherits from person. But no, that's not how it works in Java. You are not allowed to directly look at the private data in the superclass. However, you could use getID, and so you could fix this by saying just getID right here, and that would work perfectly fine. You would get this E appended to the front and then the ID from the superclass. Here's a significantly trickier riddle about inheritance in Java, and this one you may want to pause. You may need to pause to answer this. It's not so obvious what's going wrong here. I'll give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. So if you actually try to compile this code, you're going to see quite a cryptic error. And this is what it says. It says that the actual and formal argument lists differ in length. In other words, you gave the wrong number of arguments to some method you called. And normally when you get this error, it tells you which method that was. However, here, where it would normally say which method it is just pointing to the letter C in the word class, which makes no sense at all, and it's quite baffling. But you can step back and understand this by understanding how Java handles inheritance with regards to constructors, and also how it handles default constructors. So look at the employee class at the bottom. I have no constructors defined. And whenever you define no constructors, Java wants to give you a free default constructor. So Java would like to give you a free default constructor. And when I say default constructor, what I mean is just the constructor that has 0 arguments. But as part of generating that free default constructor, it needs to call the constructor of the superclass. Well, if there's 0 arguments down here, which superclass constructor will it call? It'll also just call super with 0 arguments. And do you see any constructor with 0 arguments up in the superclass? No, there's no 0 argument list in these. There's no 0 argument constructor in the superclass. And you don't get the 0 argument constructor for free up here because you did define the constructor. You defined a constructor with a single argument string name, and so that's what it's saying. It's looking for a 0 argument constructor up here, but it only finds a 1 argument constructor. So that's what it means when it says the actual and formal argument lists differ in length. Now you could fix this in any number of ways, but here's just one way to fix this. You would just go ahead and define a single argument constructor for employee. Now it's not generating that problematic default constructor that calls super and the super doesn't exist for 0 arguments. That doesn't happen anymore. And one key thing to note is that whenever I make a constructor in a subclass, you never inherit constructors, not even public ones, and I have to call super as the very first line of that constructor in the subclass. So that's a great thing to know about inheritance in Java. The third problem that's going to ruin a high score on AP CSA is treating return values like an afterthought. And this mistake drives me crazy because it's a bad mistake, but I see it all the time. What happens is this. I'm working with a student trying to raise their AP CSA score, going through some FRQs. And so the student starts writing the question, and they're thinking, typing some code, thinking, typing some code, and they get 8 or 10 lines of code written, and then they stop and look at me, and they say, "Wait, what am I supposed to return here?" And I think, what? What are you doing? Why did you start writing a question if you had no idea what your method's actually supposed to return? Writing a method when you don't know what it returns is like building a machine, but you don't know what the machine does. You're putting gears and pulleys and machine parts together, but you don't know if you're making a pasta maker or a chainsaw. That does not make sense. So you want to know exactly what type you return and what that return value represents before you write the first line of a method. Now I understand that figuring out what to return can be very tricky and confusing. Actually, no, it's not confusing at all. They tell you exactly what to return, what type it is, what it represents on every single question. Let's have a look at that. So here's the 2024 exam. This is the real exam from 2024. It's not something I just made up for this YouTube video. And you can see quite clearly here that they tell you exactly what to return on all the different methods. So here, for number 3A, you want to return a Boolean. Now, what does that Boolean represent? It's going to be true if each element of word list, except the first, contains the previous element as a substring, and false otherwise. How about problem 3B? Well, that is going to return an array list of strings. And what strings do I want to put into that array list? Well, from my word list in my object, I'm going to take all of these strings that start with target, and I'm going to remove target from the beginning of each of those words. That's it. Now, if that's still a little confusing to you, you go a couple pages down, they've got a nice example. You are starting with this word list, and they are calling .createList with the parameter cat. So you just grab each of these that begin with cat, you chop the cat off, and you put it in the answer. Here, catch a cat, you chop cat off, you put it in the answer. Here it's just cat, so you chop that off, and you get the empty string. That's it. That's all this does. It explains very clearly. You shouldn't be thinking too hard about what to return, and you certainly shouldn't be writing half your method without knowing what you're going to return. Here's question 4. It introduces this location class that's just a row and column packaged together, and then it gives you the information about the two questions. It says, for A, you're going to return one of these location objects, and it is going to represent the next location you go to using these rules that they describe on the next page. How about question B? Question B is SumPath. It's going to take a row and column. It's going to return an int that represents the sum along that path, which again, they explain this a few pages down. Here's the path, this grade in area, and you're just adding up all the numbers on that path. How do you know which squares to go to? Well, the answer for part A gives you that. So it's just an int, it's a sum. Now, students do know that they're supposed to return stuff, and the return values matter, but they still don't treat them importantly enough. You should know it before you write the first line. And even students who know it matters and who pay attention, they often forget because they're in a rush, or they run out of time, or they're too focused on other aspects of the question. I'm going to give you a simple habit that 100% will fix this and will help you think about these questions in a clearer way. And the first part of that habit is just to be very deliberate about reading the return types and knowing exactly what you're going to return in terms of the problem you're solving right now. Then, when you go to write the code, the first thing you're going to do on the very first line is define your return value. Here, the question wants an int, so we make an int, and we're going to call it sum because that's what it represents. It represents summing up the values along that path, and we'll initialize it to 0. Now, you don't have to initialize this primitive to 0. It'll automatically be 0, but it's a great habit to set that you're always going to initialize things. Then, go straight to the bottom and return your return value. This is very valuable because you 100% lose points if you forget to return things, and people actually do this all the time. Maybe they're in a rush, or they run out of time, or they're just so worried about other aspects of the problem that they forget that bottom return statement, and then they lose points even though they kind of knew how to solve the problem. So just get that return at the bottom out of the way, and you know you're not going to lose points there. After that, you go ahead and you just write all of your code in the middle here. And this is great. This is a great habit because beyond just helping you not lose points off silly mistakes, writing out your return value in advance and being very clear what exactly you're returning and what type it is helps clarify your thought processes. And that's going to get you the right answer faster. So for this next mistake, I'm not telling you what it is at first. I'm going to work through a problem, and I want you to try and spot the mistake. So we've got this question from the 2023 exam. This is 2023-4, and we're going to do the B question of number 4. And so it introduces this question with this very simple candy class. And candy class here doesn't really do anything other than this one method called getFlavor, which is going to give us a string. And then we've got the box of candy class. It has a 2D array called box, so you know this is a 2D array question, and if there's no candy in that place in the box, it is stored as null. So let's look at the B question, and by the way, you probably don't have time to read all of these or it's a bit small. These are all available for free on the website of College Board. These are all old exams. I'll put the link in the description if you're interested. So for this B question, what they want you to do is that they want you to go through the box in this kind of unusual order, looking for candy of a specific flavor. The name of the method is remove next by flavor, and it's going to return, if you look here, it's going to return a candy object that is the candy that you found that has the correct flavor. But it gives you this strange order. It says, the following order, the last row of the box is traversed from left to right, then the next to last row, from left to right, etc., until either a piece of candy is found or the entire box has been searched. So it's not the standard order that you work in. And so when students solve this problem, this is how they tend to go about it. So the student starts writing the code, and maybe they listen to the advice from the last example, and they're defining their return values early at the start on the first line, and then they're returning it at the bottom before they write their code in the middle. You wouldn't really have to do that for this question, but it's a good habit to follow nevertheless. And then the student thinks very hard about how to set up their two nested for loops to answer this question. They have to start at the bottom row, but on each row they're still going in the normal order of left to right. So they think about this for a while, and they come up with these two for loops, which are also correct. Then they realize that they need to take the candy out of the box. How do they represent that? Well, they need to set the candy, that item in the box, that row and column, to null. But if they set it to null, how do they get the candy and return it? Well, they're going to need a temporary value to hold that candy, which here they've already defined, and they're going to call it desired candy. I guess they changed the name as they were going through for some reason, but they defined it, and they take box of row and column, and they put it into desired candy, and then they set that item to null, and they return desired candy, and they're probably feeling quite good about this answer. However, if you look at the official scoring guidelines on this question, they would have lost 2 points, and I believe this is a 5-point question. So it's only 3 of 5, which is going to be, not approximately, it's exactly equal to 60%, which is definitely not enough for a 5, and it may not even be enough for a 4. So that's pretty awful. I mean, this student likely felt good about their answer, but they're really not anywhere close to the amount of points they'd like to get. So can you spot the problem? Can you spot the problem? It's going to be right here. Okay? It's a very obvious thing that the test writers love to ask about. I don't know why, but they always make questions about this, and if you don't do it the right way, you always lose points, no matter how complicated the rest of the question is. And so you're supposed to use dot equals to compare strings. That's the key mistake here. getFlavor is, it gets you a string. The parameter is a string, as you can see, but you cannot use the double equals to compare those. That's not what they like you to do, and they always make questions about this. So we fixed it here. And yeah, you forgot to use dot equals right there. So here it is fixed. But there's still a problem. And the problem here is even harder to spot. This is actually going to be a problem. But why is that a problem? Well, some of the items in the candy box are null. And so if you try and call a dot on a null object, you're basically trying to get a method out of an object that itself does not exist, and that is going to instantly crash your entire program. You're not allowed to use a dot method on a null object. It can't process that. That's an instant fail. So how do we fix that? We're going to fix that by adding this check for null right here. This check for null. And you have to do this in a specific way. It has to go first, and it has to be an and statement. And what happens is, if the item at row and column is null, it short circuits and it does not run the second part of the if statement, which is vital, because if it is null and it even tries to do .getFlavor, the whole program crashes. Written this way, if the current item at row and column is null, it never runs this dot, and so your program is safe. So after you add this, you get 5 of 5 for that question. So that's great. So the fourth mistake is forgetting to use .equals for string. Now I say forgetting because most students know about this, they are taught this, but they just forget to do it when they're actually taking the test. And let me re-emphasize that the people who write the tests love to put this on the exam. So you have to know it. And how can you fix this mistake? If you've already learned it, how do you fix this mistake? You can fix it by being more aware of types as you code, and that's just a habit you have to build up and practice over time. You can also fix it by following the next tip. So the last problem for this video is that many students, when they're practicing for the exam, do not use a timer. Now, should you always be studying on a timer? No. Taking your time to really think through a problem, to reason about what's going on with all the variables and such as the code is running, why you might set it up a certain way, and making mistakes and working through them, and understanding how you might change your thought processes in the future to not make those same mistakes. This is a vital part of learning to code. It's the key way that you're going to build the ability to think within the domain of solving problems with Java. So don't rush for most of the year. But once you get close to the exam, you're going to want to start working on a timer as you practice in order to make sure you're on pace to finish. Now, most students, they might think, okay, for the FRQs, there's 4 questions, it's 90 minutes, you do the math, that's 22 minutes and 15 seconds per question. I say that's wrong. I say you want to train yourself to finish with time to spare. Now, why is this beneficial? If you finish with time to spare, say 10 minutes, you have time to glance over all the code you've written and spot mistakes you may have made. You may have slipped up using .equals for string. You see that, you see, oh, I should have used .equals there, and you fix it and you get those points back. That's great. So that's one advantage of finishing with time to spare. A second advantage of finishing with time to spare is that feeling rushed to finish in and of itself can inhibit your ability to solve problems. So if you know you always finish with 10 minutes left over, you won't feel rushed, you'll solve the problems better. So what I would say is, at most, you want to set 20 minutes per free response question. That will always let you finish with 10 minutes to spare. And if you want to go 17, 18 minutes per question and finish with even more time to spare, you can do that as well. So I hope knowing those 5 mistakes can help you raise your AP CSA score. If you're still worried about the test, I offer tutoring services. I tutor AP CSA, and I also tutor data structures and algorithms, so have a look at my link in the description. Thank you for watching, and if your exam is coming up soon, good luck.